I didn't pack a suitcase. I grabbed a single rucksack, my car keys, and vanished from my childhood home before the first bird chirped. By the time they reached for the coffee pot, my parents were already spinning a web of lies, telling the neighbors I had traded my soul for a bank balance. What they refused to confess was the cold-blooded ultimatum they gave me at the kitchen table just hours before. They didn't want my help for survival or a medical crisis. They demanded I surrender the $240,000 legacy my grandfather left me, just to wipe away my brother's gambling debts for the 4th time in 3 years. My name is Serafina. I'm 30 years old now, working as a high-level creative, director with a life that finally feels like it belongs to me. But for most of my existence, I was the invisible one, the daughter who stayed quiet. Because I learned early that making noise only brought lightning. I grew up in a manicured suburb of Connecticut, in a house that looked like a postcard from the outside. The lawn was always perfect. The windows were always gleaming, and our family Christmas cards were legendary. But inside those walls, everything revolved around my older brother Cassian. He was 8 years my senior and treated like a god who had accidentally tripped into human form. Every mistake he made was excused as exploration, and every failure was blamed on a world that didn't understand his genius. When I worked 3 part-time jobs while maintaining a 4.0 GPA, my parents called it my duty when Cassian blew. Through his college fund in a single semester of partying, they called it a learning curve and took out a second mortgage to fix it. The only person who truly saw through the smoke was my maternal grandfather, Arthur. He lived in a rugged, beautiful town in Vermont, in a house that smelled like pine needles and expensive tobacco. When I visited him, I felt the weight lift off my chest. He didn't just ask me how I was. He asked me what I wanted to build. He saw the fire in me that my parents tried to extinguish. Sitting in his library felt like finally finding the oxygen I had been denied all year. A few months before the world tilted on its axis, he called me to his bedside. He didn't make a grand speech. Simply handed me a heavy envelope and a set of keys. "Serafina," he said, his voice raspy but firm. "This is for your independence. This is the $240,000 I've saved since the day you were born. Do not let them turn your future into his bail money. Use it to fly." I didn't cry because of the money. I cried because someone finally trusted me enough to give me a weapon to fight for my own life. I went home believing that for once I had a shield. I didn't realize my parents were already sharpening their knives. The shift happened with a speed that felt rehearsed, like a play they had been practicing while I was away. The day after I returned from Arthur's funeral, my mother approached me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, that careful, sugary tone she used when she was about to strip me of something. My father was already anchored at the heavy oak kitchen table, and Cassian was leaning against the refrigerator, tapping his foot, not even pretending to offer condolences. My mother folded her hands neatly. "Your brother is facing some legal complications, Serafina. It's a misunderstanding, but it requires immediate capital." I stayed silent. I had heard a version of this script since I was 10. My father cleared his throat, his voice booming with a false authority. "The lawyers say $200,000 will settle the private debts and keep his record clean. We know what Arthur gave you. It's only right that the family benefits from his passing." I felt a coldness settle in my marrow. They didn't ask how I was grieving. They didn't ask about the career pivot I had been planning. My future wasn't even a footnote in their conversation. My mother leaned closer, her perfume cloying and heavy. "Family helps family, Serafina. Think of how proud your grandfather would be to know he saved our name." I looked at Cassian, waiting for a shred of shame. He just shrugged and said, "You've always been the smart one. Sis, you'll make it back in a year or 2. I need this today." Something inside me finally snapped, not with a bang, but with the quiet click of a lock turning. That money wasn't a family fund. It was my exit strategy. My father's jaw tightened when he saw my expression. "You can delay your little business venture. Your brother doesn't have the luxury of time. This is an emergency." That was the moment I realized they weren't negotiating. They were colonizing my life. I thought about every time I had been told to wait, to shrink, to understand. Understanding had always been a one-way street leading to my own disappearance. I tried to be the good daughter one last time. Why is it always my future that has to be the collateral for his mistakes? My mother's face hardened instantly, the sweetness replaced by a sharp, jagged edge. "Because you are strong enough to handle it. Don't be so dramatic and selfish. We are talking about your brother's life." Cassian let out a sharp, mocking laugh. "You're acting like we're asking for your kidney." "It's just paper, Serafina." The air in the room felt thick, dangerous. My father stood up slowly, looming over the table. "You need to think very carefully about your next words. If you aren't with this family, you are against it. I understood the threat. It was the same one they had used to keep me in line for decades, the threat of exile. That night, I lay in my bed staring at the ceiling, replaying the venom in their voices. It wasn't the $240,000 that hurt the most. It was the realization that my value to them was entirely transactional. By 4 a.m., the clarity hit me like a splash of ice water. If I gave them this money, I wouldn't just be broke. I would be a ghost in my own life. I said no the following evening. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just stood in the doorway and said no. Not a single cent. The fallout was a hurricane. My mother's voice didn't rise. It dropped to a hiss. You are a monster. After everything we gave you, you'd let your brother rot for a career? My father didn't even look at me. Then you have no father. If you can't be a part of this family's survival, you aren't a part of this house. Cassian threw a glass against the wall, shouting that I was a backstabbing bitch. The pressure was suffocating. They started listing every meal they had ever fed me, every pair of shoes they had ever bought me, as if my life was a debt I could never fully repay. I felt myself wanting to shrink, to apologize, to make the noise stop. But I caught the impulse. I stood my ground and said, I'm done paying for a life I didn't choose. I retreated to my room and locked the door, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. My phone erupted, texts from aunts, cousins, and family friends. All fed the same lie, that I was unstable and had stolen the family's inheritance to spite my parents. I realized then that they weren't angry because I was selfish. They were angry because their favorite ATM had finally closed its doors. I waited for the house to go silent. I didn't need a suitcase. I took my rucksack, my documents, and the keys Arthur had given me. I walked out of that house without looking back, the night air feeling like a baptism. I sat in my car, hands shaking on the wheel, and for the first time in 30 years, I breathed a breath that belonged entirely to me. I drove toward Vermont. I arrived at Arthur's house as the sun began to bleed across the horizon. His old lawyer and executor, a sharp woman named Beatrix, was already on the porch. She didn't ask questions. She just handed me a folder. Arthur knew, she said simply. He left a recorded statement with the bank and the estate lawyers. He knew they would try to claim the $240,000 as family property. He made sure the paper trail was ironclad. Over the next few days, I stayed in that house, listening to the silence and letting the poison drain out of my system. My phone remained a battlefield of guilt trips and threats, but for the first time I had a fortress. A week later, they arrived. My parents and Cassian pulled into the driveway, looking like they were ready for a siege. My mother tried the worried parent act first, rushing toward me with open arms. Serafina, darling, we were so scared. You weren't thinking clearly. I stayed behind the screen door. My father stepped up, his face a mask of disappointment. This has gone far enough. We need to settle the bank transfer. Today, or Cassian's creditors will come for our house next. Cassian stood behind them, looking entitled and impatient. Beatrix stepped out from the shadows of the porch then, holding the folder. The house and the funds are legally Serafina's, and any attempt to coerce her will be met with a harassment suit. Furthermore, she added, her voice like a razor, I have the records of the loans Arthur gave you over the years, totaling nearly $500,000, all marked as final support. You have no claim here. The transformation was chilling. My mother's concern evaporated into a snarl. You're a traitor, she screamed. My father looked at me with genuine hatred. You've destroyed this family over a pile of money. I finally spoke, my voice calm and unwavering. No, you destroyed this family when you decided I was a resource instead of a daughter. Cassian destroyed it when he decided he was too good for consequences. I'm just the one who stopped paying the bill. Cassian lunged forward, but my father held him back, realizing for the first time that they had no power here. They left screaming that I would regret this, that I would die alone. The silence that followed, their departure was the most beautiful thing I had ever heard. That night, I sat at Arthur's old library table and cried, not for the family I lost, but for the girl who finally stopped letting them take pieces of her. The fallout wasn't a clean break. Cassian's world crumbled within months. Without my support, my parents had to sell the perfect suburban house to cover his debts. They moved into a cramped apartment, the stress finally forcing them to face the reality they had spent decades avoiding. They still send the occasional message alternating between begging and blaming. I don't answer. I use my $240,000 to run my own firm now. I live in a house that smells of pine and peace. I've learned that setting a boundary isn't an act of war. It's an act of self-preservation. I didn't abandon them. I simply stopped participating in my own destruction. If you're listening to this and you feel that familiar knot of guilt in your stomach, the one that tells you your life belongs to everyone but you, listen closely. Love that requires you to vanish isn't love. It's a transaction. And choosing your own future isn't a crime. It's your only hope. If this story touched you, share your experience in the comments. And if you want to see more stories of people finding the strength to walk away and reclaim their power, hit subscribe to Fire Off Revenge